Hello, and thank you for choosing this Analyst Insight podcast from the Information Security Forum. If you are a new listener, thanks for tuning in, and you're very welcome. I'm sure you will find this discussion very thought-provoking. And same goes for long-time listeners who are also very welcome and who we should thank for supporting us, because we've been doing quite a few of these now, and our audience is gradually building up. So thanks for coming along with us. My name's Mark Ward. I'm a Senior Research Analyst at the ISF, and this podcast is one of a couple we will be doing about AI and machine learning. Topics that are very much in the news right now, and I'm sure on the minds of security practitioners as well. In this first podcast, we'll be looking at technology and behind AI, ML, and trying to get a sense of how it might develop and change over the next few years, and as well some of the issues that it throws up when you're starting to use it. And in the second podcast, we'll look more into the threats and risks that AI and ML pose. So to discuss that first topic of where this technology is going, I'm joined by two people who know their way around both AI and the near future. The first is David Sully, co-founder and CEO of AI firm Advai, which helps organizations stress test AI systems. Hello, David.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. I just one question to start with. Are you surprised at how much news there is out there at the moment, how fast things are going? Because to me, it's kind of reminiscent of the dot-com era. But does that surprise you? You thought, nah, this is completely expected. Of course, AI was always going to prove itself in this kind of way.
Yeah, I think we're in a really fascinating time where it's caught the imagination of the public, and I think that particularly this year in the last few months with ChatGPT, I think that is why it feels particularly fast. We've been talking about AI for, at least in my areas, for the last 5-10 years. I think it's just that people haven't been able to interact with it in quite the same way that they currently are, where you can log in, talk to ChatGPT, for example, and just see some really incredible results coming from it. And that just brings it to life. So for me, at the moment, it's really busy because of elements like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's that democratization of it, if that's the word, just putting it in people's hands. And I think that it has some of that. It does make it a bit more reminiscent of that dot-com era when people started doing their own web pages and all kinds of stuff like that. I think there's a lot of fire and fury around that for sure. But we'll see, and hopefully we'll talk about some of that, how that might develop. But also here is Max Brook, who is lead author on Threat Horizon this year, and the report was changed quite a bit, and to consider not just individual threats, but the different ways the near future could play out, which is very relevant to this conversation. Hello, Max.
Hi, Mark. Hi, both.
I just wondered, did you have AI explosion on that list of possible futures at all, or was it sort of one of those out there kind of, no, it'll never happen type situation?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those things. It's just impossible to avoid, really, at the moment. And I think echoing a bit of what David said at the start there, really, it's very instantly become quite translatable to not just professionals with that knowledge and sort of in-house experience, but it's gone a bit wider than that. So, yeah, we sort of in a way try to avoid AI because it's cropped up many times throughout Threat Horizon in the past when we've looked at threats, but inevitably, and I'm sure we'll cover this, it snuck back in really through the back door and it's sort of scattered throughout the report.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those behind the scenes themes, isn't it? Sort of one of those things that's just changing things in all kinds of ways. But just to get the conversation starting and to harken back to that point about the dot-com era, because I was a technology reporter during the dot-com era, saw some crazy stuff around then. I remember one conversation with two guys who had, I think, a domain name for cheese, and they were convinced that the future was about selling cheese to people online, which is broadly played out. I mean, because I buy cheese online, but it's part of other things. But I don't know, are we in that kind of era, David? Just that people are making crazy claims or think, I've got this right, now I can make a lot of money out of it? Or is it, I just wonder if you have any memories of those times and are a bit skeptical about what's happening now.
Yeah, so less memories of necessarily the dot-com bubble, so being able to translate that to now I find difficult. But I think there are definite parallels in sort of AI has this massive potential. Everybody's in agreement on that. I think the challenge is actually identifying what it's really, really useful for right now versus the promise, and understanding that is going to sit at the heart of whether or not it's rapidly adopted. And I think you're seeing this in certain areas where, for example, over the years, Waymo's devaluation, or the fact that actually you aren't being driven by a Tesla yet, despite sort of 6 years of promises that that's just 6 months away. So you've got elements that are just incredibly challenging, and AI might not be ready to do it yet. And then you've got other bits where actually when you find a sweet spot for what the AI can genuinely do and can be trusted to do, then that's where you've got adoption and you've got the use cases where actually a company earns a vast amount of money, or like a new breakthrough becomes possible. And that gets really exciting around things like healthcare and detection of cancers and things like that when that becomes possible.
Yeah, I think certainly with the dot-com era, there was a lot of false starts. A lot of people thought, "Oh, I know what people are going to do," and then it just didn't play out. And now I think a lot of people have been surprised and by the effect that it has had. And I think that's just the other. What also makes me think that now is about like that dot-com era. We just don't know. There's you can see some obvious stuff because it's doing better the things we do now, but it's the new stuff, I guess, that we struggle to understand. I don't know, Max. I guess you're too young to remember the dot-com boom, perhaps. But I just wonder is it like crypto here? I don't know, because that was another boom that happened recently and then fizzled out. But I guess the difference here is people are using it. I mean, ChatGPT is out there and all kinds of other tools as well.
Yeah, I mean, slightly giving away my age, which is the good thing about a podcast, is you're sort of hidden behind the voice. But yeah, so I can't really compare it to that in any sort of reasonable sense. But no, I do think it has more legs than something like crypto. I think it's more easily understood by sort of the layman and people who aren't operating or working in a space where it's really relied on or part of the day to day. But I do wonder, and maybe it's a question for you, David, actually, whether now that it's out there and there's more of an appreciation or understanding of it, amongst sort of the masses, you might say, that will that sort of define the way it's used and it's sort of how it might be shaped in the future going forward. And I know you mentioned healthcare or something like autonomous driving in vehicles, whether that sort of public pressure and perception of it actually starts to change how it's how it's used, rather than just sort of boffins hidden away, looking at how it might be relevant for whatever they're working on.
That's a really good question and really challenging to answer. I think that so greater understanding of it can only be a good thing, in my opinion. The problem is that even those developing it don't necessarily understand it yet.
Yep.
And there's this really, if you dig through some of the industry research, there's this really telling statistic that I've cropped up on, and I've been told multiple times by companies who see a lot of different AI projects, that actually 85%, it's always around 85 to 87% of AI models are failing when they're deployed.
Yeah.
And a lot of AI is getting stuck at the proof of concept stage. And there's lots and lots of different reasons for that. It's really complex. It's really difficult to understand. It's very hard to know, have you got the right data, sufficient data? How does that data genuinely relate to your use case? But then there are also really tricky bits around trust and uncertainty. So if you are trying to put in an AI system for loan authorizations in a bank, for example, how can you show the regulator that this model is going to operate consistently in a scenario that you might not have hypothesized? So in unusual financial events, for example, or data feeds coming into it change over time. And that's the bit that sort of when you get into risk frameworks and sort of somebody saying, right, I'm going to deploy this, that's where the industry is really struggling, I think. And asking somebody to do it just on trust and let's hope that we've got this right is a very difficult proposition. And the second bit to that is, so you've got the internal challenges, but then you've also got the regulatory principles that are going to be coming through. So UK government has put out its ethical AI principles. You've got the NIST framework in the US, and you've got the EU AI regulatory work that's going on at the moment. And so there's that uncertainty as well of, right,
Yeah.
so again, it comes down to sort of like, what's the use case? Is it going to be useful for this? And can we trust it enough, in my opinion?
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think that's the big difference now, is that regulatory focus and worry as well. I think because I think we all get that it could do profound things in all kinds of ways, but we don't know the impact, and I think that's very much a difference to that .com era, is that just there weren't the regulations there because people just wanted to get it done and get it built and just see what happened, and then we're living with the consequences, unfortunately. And some of them are good, some of them are bad. But I just wonder, do you think? I'm not sure people do understand it. I think they think it's really cool and they want to use it, but I don't know that they necessarily. I think some people have a very overblown idea of what type of AI this is, because we're not talking about super smart computers here. We're talking about things that are relatively narrowly intelligent and are pretty cool tools, can do some interesting things. But I don't know, David, is it, in your opinion, is it more than just a really good autocomplete, or is it sort of more of there's proper use you can get out of it, but it does take a lot of work to get to that point?
So as of yet, I haven't seen an AI system that is more than a pattern recognition system yet. So it's always important to remember that that's sort of what it is at heart. It doesn't have contextual understanding. It doesn't know when it's wrong. And so if you've got a pattern recognition task, it can be great. And there's a really, really good, there's quite a fun way of doing this and sort of seeing it for yourself is the easiest thing for you to fact check is yourself. So if you go into ChatGPT, ask it to tell you about yourself. So tell me about David Sully. And typically what it will start off with is, that's not enough information for me to identify who that is. So you start feeding it little bits of tidbits. So for me, it's like, oh, he's human. He's British. He's alive. He's male. And you reach a tipping point depending on how much information there is related to that name. So if you've got a very common name, or there's loads of published material out there, this will happen sooner. But it will then tell you about, for example, David Sully. And for me, it says, right, David Sully is an illustrator. And then it gives 5 books that David Sully has illustrated, children's books. And those books are genuine, the authors are genuine, but there is no illustrator called David Sully that has illustrated them.
Wow.
And everybody that this is a little test that I've suggested a few other people have done, and each time we've had the same thing, where particularly those with a more public profile, it's provided everything looks really correct and everything is largely correct, but then all of a sudden it just chucks in, oh, they worked for Bain Capital, they worked for PwC, or they were a journalist or something like that, and that isn't them. And so it's a really good representation of all it's doing is matching patterns and providing text based on that pattern.
Yeah, I think I should do that for myself, because there are quite a lot of .wards. A former Everton footballer, I think, was one, and there's actually, I remember looking it up, and there's a rodeo bull rider in the US as well. So if it confuses me and him, that'd be very interesting, I think. But I think people are a bit that hallucination is a weird kind of issue around it, isn't it? Just sort of like say that pattern recognition on what it tries to tell you what you think you want to know, I suppose. But it's I suppose one of the problems that organisations need to confront with this is just, how do they trust it, and what tools do they use to make sure it is giving them useful and true information.
But this is what it all comes down to. So if you're writing a blog or something creative where actually fact doesn't really matter, in fact maybe like it's fiction or something like that, or and you're using it, so to write a novel or a blog or something like that, that can be really good. But asking that same system to write a legal document would be a very bad idea. And it's that one of the really, really big challenges, and this goes particularly with something like ChatGPT, where you've got no understanding of the data set behind it, or how it's been trained, or what the parameters are, or anything else like that, is this right for my use case? And that's where the danger kind of comes in. Because when you start using it for the wrong use case, then that's a problem. And it's really difficult to identify when the thing is giving you a false statistic or false fact.
It's interesting. Max, I know you've done work for Threat Horizon on the future of data and the future of work. So was those types of issues part of that, the background for those scenarios, just trust and utility, I suppose, getting it to prove it does what it says and making sure you get the use case right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think it's a perennial problem, really, of this sort of technology and movement forward is this idea of trust and uncertainty and the inability to validate some of what you're getting back. But definitely we found, especially in the future of work and the future of data when we were assessing it, really, is that there was a lot of problems cropping up from over-reliance, really. And actually, if you sort of jump too deep and too fast into building, or using and relying on artificial intelligence or some similar sort of technology to do these sort of tasks that David was alluding to, then it's very difficult to revert back, and actually you start to lose that control and that oversight and that ability to, as much as it might take longer and it might, a far more tedious process with an individual human, actually you have that control and that sort of, innate trust in a way between individuals, and you sort of lose that massively with that aspect. So it's interesting. It's something we want to keep an eye on going forward, because undoubtedly it'll continue to grow and develop.
Yeah, I think if I still were a journalist, now would be the time to start gathering the horror stories for the inevitable crash, because I think we're sort of, certainly with the dot-com boom and bust. I just wonder, are we in for a bust, do you think, David? There's some sharp reality shocks about to hit organisations who've committed to this and gone, oh, hang on, it's not doing what we expected, and they are going to get into trouble. Unfortunately, they might, it might prove it doesn't work, and it might be an expensive mistake.
It's a really good question again, and the answer is I don't know. Which is a really rubbish answer, I recognise, but the reason I'm not, so I don't think that there's going to be a bust, because when you get it right, it can be so valuable. But could there? So one of the things that we're starting to see this year is just a lot more interest in sort of trying to bring rigor to testing and evaluation of AI systems. And my gut feeling is simply that that's because a lot of organizations are starting to realize actually this is really difficult and we still want it, but it's just a lot harder than we thought. And we need a way of potentially earlier in the process deciding, is this going to work or not? So I don't see it like fizzling out or anything like that. I think it's going to continue growing. It's just for some of the tasks that people desire of it, it needs another leap in AI capability, some step that hasn't been found yet to be used for the purposes that certain organizations want it to be used for. And an example of that is contextual understanding, that a lot of these systems, until they have that, they are always going to be risky to implement.
Yeah, because like say they're not embedded in reality in some respects, and nor in that fog of background information that all humans use whenever they talk about things. Certainly that you need if you're thinking about trusting something. But I've seen that there's that statement put out by OpenAI and about their mission, and they did frame it in those terms to develop that ultimate general autonomous intelligence. But I don't know. I'm skeptical, because I'm an old man shaking my fist at the clouds kind of thing, saying, "What were you youngsters and your technology? What are you doing?" kind of thing. But I don't know. Is that ultimately where we're going, or is it just going to be pattern recognition again? I don't know. I'm not sure where the technology is going to lead us. It's a heck of a question to land.
It's a big one.
I think basically at the moment, we obviously engage really heavily with sort of the state-of-the-art research side of things, and it's simply that we're not seeing any of the research that is going to do that big leap yet, and there are various bits and pieces, there are various ideas, but none of them are actually implementable yet, and nobody's. And I say this with sort of like with the massive caveat that the problem is there's huge amounts of investment going into some of these companies, and all of a sudden you get these leaps. And DeepMind do this, OpenAI have done it, obviously. So where essentially nobody sees it coming, and so it could be 6 years away, but it could be 6 weeks away, but it does need another advance in order to be used for anywhere where, for example, at the moment you're relying on a human to basically use common sense. And common sense is sort of like something that's innate to all of us, but AI doesn't have. So object detectors are such a good example of this. And so when you hear about, say, a Tesla driving into the back of an emergency service vehicle or something like that, that is likely happening because all it is an arrangement of pixels that it has not seen before, or has associated with something benign. And that's all it is. Whereas any human in the world would very, very clearly go, there's flashing lights, something weird going on, I better slow down. That's not what an AI can do. It just goes, there's an arrangement of pixels here. What have I been trained to do when I see this arrangement of pixels?
Yeah, I've had colleagues who've ridden in some of the autonomous cars that Google did, and it said it was really frustrating because they go at the pace of a very old driver, because whenever they see anything they don't expect, they stop and wait for the situation to resolve itself, or to be assessed, or for the passenger to go, yes, please continue. And I think that. I mean, obviously that's the cautious way to do it, rather than, I think in San Francisco there was one company that basically was using experiences on the road to train its vehicles, which meant that there was a glitch in one of the maps they were using, so suddenly 20 cars turned up on the same road. And it was all like, well, it's clearly something's gone wrong there. But it's like, no, we're just testing. This is the way we're going to iron out these glitches. But that seems potentially a very risky way to do that. Definitely, yeah. But I don't know, Max, in terms of the workshops and things that we ran, were a lot of worries about AI aired, when sort of future work and things like that as well, just that people don't know what it's doing to their organizations, and I guess worried what it could do, and in the future they'll just turn around and go, yeah, that wasn't a good idea.
Yeah, I think, sort of looking back at what David just mentioned, it's definitely, I think, sort of the people we've been speaking to at the workshops and the whether it's at World Congress or something like that, have a different appreciation, because they're knowledgeable and they're sort of informed, and they're working with this stuff on the daily and in irregular sort of sense. But so they definitely have that perception of it being an aid, and it's being used for that taking the burden off the human workload, and actually just giving them the ability to be the sort of the fact checker and the end piece of the puzzle. But I think some of the interesting conversations we've definitely had, Mark, is about it, and sort of links to some of the hype cycle of it a little bit, and actually that need to draw back and understand where it fits in, because I think there's definitely a different appreciation depending on your experience and how and where you work about what artificial intelligence really means to you. And I think for some it's robots working side by side with us, and having a totally different sort of appreciation and experience of life. But actually how we get to that point has never really been discussed. It's a bit sci-fi, and it's a bit out there, and I don't know.
Yeah, but I think, maybe that's something, the lesson we need to learn. Is that what you're seeing, David? If people are learning how to work with AI, I mean, that's what we've got with the situation at the moment, that we don't quite know. But I guess we're in that exploratory, finding out mode, and trying to work out the things it can do, and also the safeguards you need to put around it as well, which is what Advai does, I believe. It just sort of stress test those systems, that entire value chain of using AI.
So I think that is the stage that we're in at the moment. That identification of real value and the use cases that it can be used for. Absolutely. So in our mindset, sort of what we do is, so we're basically actively stress testing the systems and the data sets at each stage of the MLOps lifecycle. So all the way through development, and that's partly because you can have butterfly effects, essentially. So something very early in development, something in the data set that then has this cascade reaction through that system right through to deployment. So you need to be across the whole lot. The challenge is that that's just incredibly complex, and you're demanding an awful lot of data scientists to get each stage right. And So that's sort of like where we look. But at heart, one of the principles that we're kind of looking at is it's by far and away the least sexy sort of term you will hear in AI adoption, but it's essentially realistic AI. So
Yeah.
is the model that you're building actually fit for purpose? Is it right for what you are trying to do? And how can you maybe constrain it if need be, so that it won't do everything that you want it to do? But what if you can get it fully automated on maybe just 20% of the workload, but you can trust all of that output from that AI system? Okay, that might not be the hype, that might not be sort of the really exciting sort of like world-changing amount at first, but that is something that can be implemented and justified, say, to a regulator or to your chief risk officer or whoever it is, and then you can start working from that. And you go, right, we have AI fully working effectively. Like, now let's start trying to broaden that out. And what's more, we've managed to massively ease the workload on our personnel, for example. And that's sort of our approach. It's not sexy, but it's functional, it's realistic, and that's where the technology is at the moment.
Yeah, I've seen a sort of similar type to things to that, just in terms of some researchers getting analysing a lot of interviews they've done from various people and just sort of trying to get the ChatGPT or similar type of systems to just pass some of that, because there's potentially a huge amount of information there, and just interrogating it a bit and trying to have a conversation with all those people at the same time rather than on a one-to-one basis. But I think, yeah, it is that proving, it's that baby steps, isn't it? Making sure it does what we expect it to do and developing the capabilities and seeing where it can help as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, David. No, I just wanted to ask you a question, really, again. So apologize for that. But I remember hearing a talk from you, sort of the back end from last year at Warwick University, and sort of delving a bit further and deeper into what Advai is doing and some of those aspects of AI. But I think as well, I often come away from conversations around this, and I'm sure I will today. And I think it's quite a sort of a deeper philosophical question, in the sense of it's both technical and there's also the human ethical aspects inside to it. So I was just interested in, I think you've got quite an interesting and varied background, and actually, does those experiences help you tackle some of these questions and dilemmas that you might have, that you face and we face at the ISF and our members do as well?
Oh wow, you're coming out with a deep question.
Yeah, but I think it's a good one to ask, because certainly I did some work on governance, and the sort of at the higher operating levels of governance, ethics and all kinds of, the conscience of the company comes into it as well, and and certainly with AI and certainly the regulatory side of it, they're really worried about what this is going to do to people, and whether the data they've got is good. So yeah, it's an interesting. Yeah, I think it's, again, one of those issues that crops up, just how you use this and what does it do to people, because it will.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting area. So bear in mind, so what we try and do is essentially identify why AI fails. So how does it fail? Why does it fail? How can we prevent that from happening? And we really care about metrics, and so like providing ways to measure, say, the robustness of the system, the balance in the data set, and all those like different elements that technically are really important. But on the other end of the spectrum, you've got all of these ethical elements which aren't easily measured. So, for example, when you say, how can you measure what is an ethical or unbiased AI? You can measure technical bias, but it's very, very difficult to start bringing measurements to things that we as humans might perceive differently. If you ask any one human, they might have a different answer to the same question. And so that's that sort of softer side of it, which isn't a metric. It might be down to, so we talk about organizational readiness and technical readiness. So your organizational readiness is much more around actually who are the people that are using this system? Do they understand what it's good and bad for? Are they ready for it? Are they going to be using it in an ethical and principled manner? And sort of, is the organization going to be using it on that side? And that's more sort of, that is a softer side of it. And that's where a lot of, say, the UK principles for AI are currently sat, where it talks about the organizational side. The challenging bit is then how do you dock that together with a technical bit where what are the metrics that matter, and sort of you can measure accuracy really easily, which is why everybody does that. But actually, how do you measure fairness? How do you measure explainability?
Yeah, because there's other aspects. Because again, remembering from my philosophy classes, just trying to define what's a sandwich. So good luck trying to define sort of much more abstract issues like justice or fairness of outcomes and all kinds of things like that. And if you do start to codify them, then what implications does that have for long term?
Exactly.
There's all kinds of other nasty issues. So, but in some respects, that's good, because if we can confront them, then perhaps we can make some progress on them. And that could be the good side of AI for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But these are just such challenging things that if you're collecting up data, for example, if you've got bias that in how that data is being collected, I don't know, an example would be in the US where there is work around how AI might be used in the justice system, for example. And obviously, an AI trained on data from historic decision making, in that, what happens when actually that decision making has been biased? And how can any data scientist be responsible for essentially determining, oh, that was an unbiased decision versus a biased decision? You can't really ask that of the data scientist, but you should be asking that of the organization.
Yeah, and definitely a role for government and regulators there, and just taking that broader, bigger view, because individually, I suppose an organisation could solve it to their own satisfaction for all kinds of commercial reasons and others as well. But beyond that, they shouldn't be doing policy by proxy, I suppose. Tricky stuff. But I think that's a point to wrap it up. Leave our listeners with some knotty questions to debate amongst themselves. Many thanks to David and to Max for joining in this discussion. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground there. Thank you also for listening. Tell your friends and your colleagues. You can now find ISF podcasts on all major podcast platforms. Look at the show notes for our page on Audio Boom, where you can subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. The podcasts are also available at securityforum.org, where you can also learn more about ISF research, tools, and guidance.